Welcome to another live Action for Happiness event. My name's Mark Williamson, and it's really just a pleasure to see so many of you joining us from all around the world. I'm particularly excited about both our theme and our special guest for today's event. It's a great friend of Action for Happiness, Professor Bob Waldinger. Bob, it's lovely to see you again. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
We've got so much to explore, particularly around this fantastic book that's recently come out, The Good Life, which of course is also the theme of today's event. And in a moment, we'll begin our conversation, and perhaps you could say a bit about the background to the book. But just for all of you who are joining us here today, if you've been before, thank you for coming back. Lovely to have this supportive community together again. If you're new to this, then a very warm welcome. Bob and I are going to have a conversation on this topic together for half an hour or so, maybe slightly longer, with some interactive stuff for you to get involved with. And then there'll be a chance for you to ask some questions to Bob about this just really important topic and his incredible research and anything that emerges as part of our conversation. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end this event slightly earlier than normal. Bob's got to get to an important live media interview. He's much in demand at the moment, but it's going to be a great session together. So thank you for being here. As ever, let's keep it really kind and supportive in the chat and relevant. And please do share your questions and your responses. But Bob, why don't we start? I mean, people will know you. You've done fantastic work in this area. You've also done one of these events with us before. So we're so grateful to have you back. But you didn't have this book last time. So maybe you could remind us about the amazing research that has led to this. And what's behind the Good Life?
Well, what's behind it is 85 years of research. I'm the fourth director of this study that has been going since 1938. It started with 724 people. A third of them were undergraduate students from Harvard, and 2/3 of them were from Boston's poorest neighborhoods. And both groups were studied to try to see how do young people thrive as they move from their teenage years into young adulthood. And what's unique about it, Mark, as you know, is that we've followed the same people for 85 years. We brought in their spouses, then we brought in their children. So we have gender balance now, even though we all started out with young men. And what's so unique is that we keep going back to them year after year. We have all these little points of data so that we can track people's happiness. We can track their marriage life. We can track their work life. We can track so many things about them. And that's unheard of in the way research mostly is done through snapshots at one point in time.
It really is a unique study and body of evidence. And of course, it allows you to try and attempt this question of what is it that actually makes for a good life? And I want to obviously jump straight as soon as we can to some of the key findings from that. But I wondered if we could maybe pause, because I love always hearing from this community. Maybe we could stop and just ask people in the community, what is, I guess for you, what's one of the building blocks of a good life for you? So I'm looking forward to hearing yours as well, Bob, but why don't we just take a moment to look at the chat and see what people are sharing. What's a good life for you? I'm seeing health, peace, friendship, community, good relationships, resilience, love, meaning, balance, connection, overall well-being, kindness, yoga, belonging, friendships, independence, purpose, joy, nature, integrity, exercise, trust, freedom, savoring, gratitude, lack of fear. Wow, what a list. How are you feeling seeing some of those fly past, Bob?
Well, I love this. What I'm not seeing is wealth. I'm not seeing fame. I'm not seeing winning the Nobel Prize, because so many people imagine that that's what the good life is. And so what a wonderful audience that to know that these are actually the core elements. And the UN Happiness Report, which I know you're very familiar with, Mark, that when they ask people what they need to have a good life, it's exactly the things that people have just put in this chat.
It is exactly, and I know that you well, maybe let's not assume anything. Let's dive into it. So I've heard you talk before, and of course, one of the core themes of this book is about relationships, and of course, that's something we're going to, I think, spend quite a bit of time on in this conversation. But I think I've also heard you say that actually there's something quite fundamental about the connection between health and sort of lifelong well-being. Should we start there? What are the key findings from your point of view?
Yeah. Well, that's the finding that actually hit us over the head that we did not believe. So when we followed people, we looked at, okay, what predicts, let's say when you're 40 or 50, what predicts who's gonna be healthy and happy as they get into their 70s and 80s? What are the biggest predictors? And we expected it would be cholesterol, and we expected it would be blood pressure. But the stronger predictor for us in our work turned out to be the quality of your connections with other people. Now, we thought, sure, having good connections would make us happier. That makes sense. But how could having good connections predict that you'd be less likely to get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes or arthritis? Like, we didn't believe it until other research projects began to find exactly the same thing.
I mean, that is a really stunning finding, that our connectedness to others would drive sort of those physiological and physical health factors. I mean, I think some of us have heard that research that shows that, loneliness could be as bad for us as smoking, as one example I think I've heard. But what's going on there? Why can our connectedness have such a profound effect?
Yeah, we've been spending the last 10 years in our lab studying this, and many other groups have been studying it too. And the best idea, the best hypothesis that we have is that it has to do with stress management, that we know that relationships, when they're good, help us manage stress. So all of us have stress coming along our way, often every day, certainly frequently. There's no life without stress. So for example, if I have something stressful happen today, I can feel my body rev up. I can feel my heart rate increase, and I might even start to sweat, and I start ruminating about it. And if I have someone to talk to at home or to call up, and they're a good listener, I can literally feel my body calm down. And that's what the body is supposed to do. It's supposed to rev up when we're faced with a challenge, but then when the challenge is removed, the body is meant to go back to equilibrium. What we think happens is that people who are lonely, people who are isolated and don't have those people, that their bodies stay in a kind of low-level fight or flight mode with higher levels of circulating stress hormones, higher levels of inflammation, and that happening all the time, rather than going back to baseline, wears down your body systems, many different body systems. And that's how we think it works.
So I'd love to talk more about your sort of practical tips for relationships, because given that's the case, it will make sense that we all want to invest in our connectedness. And I guess this is particularly challenging topic for those of us that might find it difficult, that might feel a bit less comfortable in our relationships, or less competent, or actually dealing with difficult relationships. So I'm sure we'll come on to that. But there was something I heard you say that I just wanted to explore briefly before we dive into the relationship detail. And I think I heard, correct me if I got this right, but you said something like the good life is actually a complicated life. Because in fact, every life is complicated, isn't it? And we have this sort of slightly naive vision that a happy life is about everything going well. What did you mean by that idea of a complicated life, Bob?
Well, first of all, it's easy to imagine that other people are having uncomplicated lives, like other people have it all figured out, and so especially if we look at social media and we look at someone else's Instagram feed or Facebook page and all the beautiful photos they post, we can imagine other people have life all figured out and I don't. And so what we know from studying hundreds of people, thousands of people over many decades, is that every life has challenges, every life has sorrow, every life is complicated for that reason. And that is just the truth of being a human being in the world. And so when we say it's a complicated life, it's to make sure that people don't sit there feeling like, gee, I must be doing life wrong because life is full of challenges, when it's full of challenges for everybody.
So in a way, you're saying that there's nothing wrong with you if you're not feeling happy right now, because that's kind of going on for everyone at some stage.
Exactly.
And that is life. The art of a good life in some ways is to know how to navigate that. And I think I heard you talk about sort of almost making yourself more happiness prone or accident prone. I love that metaphor. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, if we think about happiness, just the feeling of, am I having a good time now? So I'm really enjoying this conversation, Mark. So I'm feeling happy right now. But an hour from now, something really annoying or upsetting might happen, and I won't be happy. Happiness goes up and down, moment to moment. And we can't control what we feel. But what we can do is build a bedrock of well-being, build a bedrock of good health and solid relationships, and finding meaning and purpose in our lives. And that when we have that foundation, it's more likely that we're going to feel happy more of the time. So the idea is, that's why I like to say, happiness is an accident, moment to moment, but we can build a foundation of well-being that makes us more accident prone.
Yeah, so you can't guarantee it, but you can make it more likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice analogy. Now, another phrase that you actually introduced me to the last time you joined us to one of these events that builds on this topic of relationships is the idea of social fitness. And I guess we all understand physical fitness. You might go to the gym and build a muscle. What on earth do you mean by social fitness?
Well, it's exactly that analogy. We use that term social fitness as a way to sound like physical fitness because we think it is an ongoing practice. If I go work out today and exercise, I don't come home and say, I'm done. I never have to do that again. We know that physical fitness, taking care of our bodies, is an ongoing practice. What we find is that social fitness, taking care of our relationships, needs to be an ongoing practice as well. So when I was in my 20s, I thought, well, I've got my friends from school. I have my friends now. They'll always be my friends, and my friendships will take care of themselves. What we see as we follow people's lives is that perfectly good friendships wither away from neglect. And that what we can do is keep energizing our relationships through little actions, small actions that keep those relationships alive, lively, keep those connections solid.
So I think now might be a good time for us to do something together on this, Bob. I think you said you had a little interactive action up your sleeve that we could all try out right now as a way of reaching out to somebody, making a connection, boosting relationship. How can we do that? Let's try it out, shall we?
Okay, yeah. So if you're game, everybody, here's my challenge. Think about somebody who you miss, somebody who you haven't seen in a little too long, somebody who you want to say hi to, and take out your phone right now and send them a text or send them an email. Just say, hi, I was thinking of you, just wanted to reach out and connect. Or something like that. Whatever your words will be the right ones for you. Something very small, 15 seconds, 30 seconds to do it.
So, okay, I'm game. I'll do this right now. So I'm thinking of an old friend who I've not seen for a while. So you said sort of like thinking of you, just wanted to say hello is a really nice, non-complicated way of reconnecting. So I'm just going to write something along those lines. Thinking of you. Just wanted to say hello. So if you're up for this, folks, please do try the same. It could be an email, it could be a text, and WhatsApp in my case. But I'm going to press send now. Just checking I haven't written garbage. Oh, my phone added a little emoji. That was accidental, but it seems an appropriate one. So maybe later on in the session, we can check back in and see if that got a reply and if any of yours got a reply. Yes, I can see people in the chat saying done, sent it to my best friend from high school. Yeah, thank you to everyone who's done that. Just WhatsApped an ex-colleague. Great. So that's one lovely example. And I guess what we're showing there, Bob, is that sometimes we neglect to invest in those little connections in the way that we would remember to drink water or go for a walk? You know, it was almost like we're not thinking about friendships in the same way that we think of physical activity.
Exactly. We don't think of them as something that needs tending to. I mean, think about watering a plant. You probably, if you have a plant, you don't want it to die, you might water it every day or whatever it needs every week. We don't think of our relationships in that way. What if we took as good care of our relationships as we took care of a houseplant? And that's a low standard. But what we find is that if people do these little activities, that they have big payoffs. And again, let me say, not every time. So let's say you reach out to somebody and they don't reach back, or they don't sound enthusiastic when they do. That's okay. It's not going to be wonderful every time, but think of it more like something you do. I don't know, what's the right analogy? In football, for example, you make shots at the goal and you're not going to make it every time, but sometimes you're going to make it. And actually more times you're probably going to get a positive response from a friend than you're going to score a goal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been doing something for a couple of years now, which I think was inspired by one of our earlier conversations, Bob, which is recognizing the way I behave is I sometimes in a busy life might neglect some of those friendships. So I have a reminder in my to-do list, which is sort of part of my working day, that says, hey, check back in with an old friend. And that pops up as regularly as don't forget to send the board an update or other things that I would consider to be must-dos. And so I've sort of programmed in, and it sounds, to those people who don't like to do this, it sounds awfully, unspontaneous, but it works for me, and it helps remind me, like, oh, there's someone I care about that I've not spoken to for a while. So that has helped me a lot.
The other thing some people have told me they do is they build it into a part of their day that they do anyway. So some people have built it into their morning commute. They'll call someone if they have a car phone and it's safe. They'll just give someone a quick call. Or if they're, maybe they're on the tube in London and they use that, they say, okay, every morning on the tube, I'm going to send somebody a text. So pair it with something that you do anyway. And that may be a way to get yourself into a routine.
That's very clever, Bob. And of course, we've had BJ Fogg on one of these events before, and he talks very much about that idea of sort of connecting a thing you want to do to a thing that you do every day. So when I get out of bed, I will do this. When I'm brushing my teeth, I will do this. So that's fantastic advice. So think about a thing you do very regularly and link a friendship connection activity to that. So while you're on the bus, reach out to someone. Yeah, great ideas. But in terms of going into some of your other top tips, I heard you talk about a couple of things that really struck me. And one of them was generosity. How do we bring a sort of generosity to our relationships, and why does that matter?
Well, generosity can play out in at least a couple of ways. One is that people actually say in the UN Happiness Report, when we ask people all over the world, what do you need to feel like you're having a good life? Generosity comes up more than almost any other thing. It's generosity with time, attention, my skills. It's not just about money, for example. And so we can be generous to each other by giving of ourselves, particularly giving of our attention. We have a lot of trouble giving our full undivided attention, especially in this era of screens that are designed to capture our attention and hold them and take us away from each other. So a generous act is to turn to someone, look at someone, make eye contact, give them your full attention. That's a big deal. Another generous act could be, what we've called in the book, catching someone being good. So we often catch each other doing something wrong or doing something annoying, especially our intimate partner or our closest friend. Catch them being good, catch them doing something that you appreciate, and just let them know you appreciate it. So that's another way to be generous. And then I'll give you one more, especially for people who are lonely, for people who don't feel they have anyone to be generous toward. See if you can find a way to be of service to other people. And that could be so many different things. It could be volunteering at a food bank. It could be teaching English as a second language. It could be reading to small children. You know, they have these programs where they have older adults read to preschoolers, and everybody is just thrilled. The preschoolers adore it. The older adults are so happy to have these adorable little children to read to. And so again, these are ways of being of service, even if you feel shy around people, because it puts you in a position of using your talents and being able to give and feeling good about what you're doing.
I had something, again, that your work inspired me to do recently, which is I've been walking my dog in the mornings because my wife hasn't been able to for the last few weeks. And I've made a conscious decision to actively make eye contact with and smile at anyone who I walk past. And it's a tiny thing, and yet I feel so much more warm-hearted as a result of it. And it's just really nice to get a sense of who are these people around me. And it's so easy to be head down and to not take the moment to say hello, hi, you know. And I was just struck again about how simple that switch is, and yet how much of a difference it made.
Yes. You know, a woman wrote to me and said that she's a minister at a church, but what she does is, just like what you're doing, she will, when she goes through the security line at the airport, she will read the name tag of the security person and call them by name and look them in the eye and say, "Good morning, Joe. How is it today? Is it busy?" You know, she'll make eye contact. She'll use their name if they have a name tag. Similarly, the person who checks you out, the cashier at the grocery store, you know, similarly, you could do that. You could do that with so many people. And what it does is it makes people feel seen, because otherwise we can treat each other like objects as we go through these lines, as we go through these automatic systems where human beings are serving us. Human beings are hoping to connect. So I love what you're saying, Mark, and I think it's something we could try to do as a practice.
And you saying that, Bob, links nicely to another phrase I've heard you using about radical curiosity. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, this comes from some research on, like, when are we best at knowing what someone else is feeling, right? It's empathy, like, you know, knowing if my partner is feeling angry or sad or happy, right? When are we the best at it? And we're the best at it when we first get together, when we start dating, because if you think about it, we're so focused on, is this person into me? And so we hang on their every glance, their every eyebrow raise, right? And then let's say we get together, we stay together, and we've been together for 10 years. We get worse and worse at knowing what our partner is feeling the longer we're together. We think the reason is that we assume we know them after a while, and we stop paying attention. So radical curiosity is that practice with the person you know so well, of coming to your encounter with that person and asking yourself, what's here that I have not noticed before? So, you know, I've been married for 37 years. My wife and I have dinner almost every night. Sometimes I do this. I sit down with Jennifer, and my job quietly to myself is to say, okay, what am I going to notice now about Jennifer and about our being together that I've never noticed before in these 37 years? It's a challenge, but it makes for a much more lively interaction than the usual ho-hum dinner.
Well, when I read this, I actually put one of my little reminders that pops up. So once a week now, I've got a what's here that I've never noticed before reminder. popping up that I don't know which relationship or conversation I'll be in, but I'm grateful to you for having brought that to my attention, because I think it's a sort of form of mindfulness, isn't it, really? It's sort of paying attention in the moment in a way that you might sometimes be on autopilot. So I
Yeah.
really like that. Thank you, Bob. Now, I think when we're on this topic of relationships, and so much of your research has just really reinforced this vital, sort of almost like life-giving importance of relationships. I think we sometimes, well, I know there are some of us that find relationships less comfortable than others. And of course, a classic way of thinking about this is extroverts and introverts. And I like that definition that extroverts tend to get more energized being with others, and introverts tend to get more energized being by themselves. I think that's quite a nice way of thinking about those two categories. But of course, this doesn't mean, this is not more relevant for extroverts and introverts, is it? It just means they might respond in a different way. Is that correct?
Exactly. And what it means is that there's no set number of connections you ought to have in your life. People often ask, like, is there a right number, right, of how many people should be in my life? And no, there's not, for just the reason you're talking about, Mark, that some of us, if we're shy, we really just need a few people, maybe one or two people in our lives, and then everybody else is kind of exhausting. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And others of us need more people in our lives. And that it's a very personal determination where we look inward and we say, what works for me? What I will say, when we talk about good relationships, they can come from anywhere and everywhere. But we think that everybody, including shy people and extroverted people, all of us, need at least one relationship where we feel like that person will be there when we need them. So at one point, we asked our research participants, we said, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? List everybody. And, most of our folks could list several people. Some of our folks could not list anyone. And a few of them were married, and they couldn't list anyone. And so what we think is that all of us, no matter where we are on the introversion, extroversion spectrum, all of us need at least one or two people who we feel have our backs, that will be there when the going gets tough.
And I hope that many people in this community will have someone like that. But Bob, let's lean into the difficulty here, which is there are some people who are bereaved or single, or trying to get out of a really difficult relationship, or they are just lonely and isolated, and actually may have even struggled with the challenge we set earlier of like contacting someone. They maybe couldn't think of somebody, or they don't feel confident in going out to reach out. So it's a bit like sometimes when you tell someone who struggles to sleep how important it is to sleep more. It's like it's the last thing they need to hear. Someone who's having difficulty with relationships, the last thing they need to hear is relationships are really important. It's almost more pressure. What can we do, even if things are really tough for us right now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what people are doing right now, which is attending this webinar, is a really good thing. And, to remind yourself that there are, first of all, other people who are in the same situation. You are not alone. And then we know from research that there are certain situations we can put ourselves in where we are more likely to be able to make connections. And so one of those is the being of service. So if you can find some way to volunteer alongside other people. And another is to do something you love. Again, it could be, a gardening club. It could be a cricket team. It could be working to prevent climate change. It could be so many things. What we know is that if you put yourself alongside other people who share an interest, that's a really good place to start, because then you have a shared interest that you can start a conversation about. And that if you can be in a situation where you see the same people over and over again, you're more likely to start deepening conversations, and with a few people, develop friendships. That's why the coffee machine at work, or in the US, we talk about the water cooler, where people gather around because they need to get their coffee or their water. That those are important because they are these places where casual conversations start. And that's where even those of us who are lonely can dip a toe into the water of making new connections.
I really like that idea of alongside others, doing something that you enjoy alongside, because it is helping to build some of those bonds. And of course, those water cooler moments when we're in the same physical space are great. But I wonder, especially in the sort of the post-pandemic world where many, many more of us have been able to connect online thanks to technology and necessity. I'm glad you mentioned the webinar tonight, actually. And we've seen the same in the Action for Happiness app community, where people have formed not just connections, but actual friendships and a sense of togetherness from just sharing like-minded ideas and inspiration online. And maybe the only thing they really know about each other is their username and the fact that they're a kind, like-minded person. And yet people say it's so supportive, this has really helped me. And I've been inspired to see how much connection you can have digitally as well as obviously in person.
Yeah, I can say a little about that from what research is telling us. There's a lot more we have to learn about how we're using digital media, but it seems to be the case that how we use digital media is hugely important. So if we use it actively to connect the way we're doing now, like people are not just in the webinar, they're chatting with each other, and certainly in the Action for Happiness meetings, even when they're online, there's connection, right? I have a friend who during the lockdown, during the pandemic, he reached out to his grade school friends, his primary school friends, and they started forming a little group again. They hadn't seen each other in years, and now they have coffee online every Sunday morning, and they are just thrilled to be reconnected. So that's the good side. That's what that kind of active engagement helps enhance well-being. If we passively consume content online, our self-esteem is often lower, we get more depressed, we get more anxious. So if we watch someone else's Instagram feed and all those beautiful photos we post for each other and think, oh, they're having a great life, I'm not, that makes all of us feel worse. So passive consumption of digital media usually lowers our mood, and active consumption can raise our mood.
I love that distinction, and I would certainly encourage anyone who would like to join the free Action for Happiness app community, where there's always a supportive conversation going on. In a moment, Bob, we're going to come to the Q&A because people are posting questions here. So if you have a question for Bob, please use the Q&A function. And if you see someone else's question you like, you can upvote it, and it will come higher up the list. But before we do that, in talking about relationships, Bob, this has been heightened, I think, particularly in the pandemic and in the time since. But of course, we all at some point will lose loved ones and have that most challenging of experience in a relationship, which is a sense of loss and so on. And I have friends who've lost dear loved ones very recently. And I know, having seen that through them, how devastating that is, but also in a way, get the sense that it helps us reconnect with the stuff that really matters. What would be your advice from the research, how we should approach thinking about loss, death, the sort of the fact that every life comes to an end at some point?
Right. And that a lot of life is learning to deal with loss. Yeah. And of course, losses come faster and more furiously as we get older, as I'm discovering in my life. But loss is an inevitable part. And one of the things that we know, if you think about all the religious traditions around the world, every tradition has a way of mourning that involves gathering your community, right? There's a reason for that we don't, if we're lucky, we don't mourn by ourselves. We don't cope with loss by ourselves. And so what I would say is be sure to activate your community, particularly at a time of loss. I mean, I'll give you a more trivial example because it's not death, but my son just got laid off from his job last week. And, it's a loss, especially for a young adult. What he had to do, and fortunately he did this, he told everybody, rather than hiding it, rather than being ashamed and quiet about it, he reached out to everybody he knew, and everybody was so great with him, and not just helping him like think about new job opportunities, but just offering him moral support. And certainly when a death happens, offering each other moral support, offering each other the place to remember the person who has died. All of that is essential to dealing with the loss and then being able to continue with life.
And actually looking through the lens of, the fact that we all face loss at times has helped me, I think, to really appreciate relationships and friendships and loved ones, while we are still living the one precious life that we at least know we have here and now. And I think there's some kind of sense of gratitude and sort of just, even though, as you say, the good life is a complicated life, actually it's a special chance we have to connect with people. And I'm going to come to questions now, because there's been some great ones already, and thank you for all the questions and for all the votes. Joshua has just asked, from the research, what interesting findings are there about personal purpose? For example, how do people most successfully discover their sense of purpose in life?
It's a great question. And we didn't specifically study how people discover purpose. There are lots of programs. There's some good research. Some of the research on purpose finds that actually people live longer and their health stays better longer when they have a sense of purpose, when they have a sense of, this is why I get up in the morning and do what I do. So all that said, I think we only know in a big picture way that having a sense of purpose is good for us. But how we do that is a much more complicated process. You probably know that there are programs out there. There's a program called Designing Your Life, developed by some people at Stanford. And, there are other techniques, exercises we can walk ourselves through to try to uncover what lights us up, what energizes us, and therefore what might be a purpose. So, but the bottom line, in answer to your important question, is we didn't study that.
But I thank you, and I imagine that a lot of our purpose is intrinsically linked to our sense of connection and contribution to each other as well. Jackie has asked a great question. Given you've said about the health benefits of our connections, her question is: if you develop better and stronger connections later in life, is it possible to regenerate the depleted body systems?
Oh, I love that question. There is some good work on regenerating, and what they believe is that it is possible. So there's some work. Dean Ornish is a physician in the United States who's done some work about essentially healthier habits later that can reverse some of the effects even of coronary artery disease. It's somewhat controversial because the research is still in process. But I think there's some evidence to suggest that we can reverse some of these health breakdowns. Not all, of course, but that it is possible. And one of the things we do find in our book, we have a chapter called "It's Never Too Late." And in that chapter, we weave a lot of stories in through the book. They're stories of real people, even though the names are disguised. And in that chapter, "It's Never Too Late," we have stories of people who found a good group of friends for the first time in their 50s or 60s when they never expected to find friends, or people who find love in their 70s and 80s. And that doesn't speak to the health benefits, but the relationship benefits we find are always possible. Our data show that they're always possible, and they can happen when you're sure it's never going to happen for you.
Thanks, Bob. Julie's said, "Hi, I live on my own." You've talked about how good it is to reduce stress, to share things with other people. She said she'd love to have met a life partner, but it hasn't happened yet. It does have lots of friends, but what would you say to someone who lives on their own? And how do we stay away from feeling lonely at times if we are living by ourselves?
Well, I think it's hard to stay away from feeling lonely all the time. That loneliness is something that happens to us, to all of us. I bet there's no one in this session right now who doesn't know the experience of feeling lonely at times. So one thing is to learn about the experience of being lonely, and there you might bring more curiosity. Maybe you've already done this, but to say, when you're having an evening, when you're feeling especially lonely, really let yourself investigate. What does this feel like in my body? What does it feel like in my head, in my mind? What, so first know more about loneliness, um, and then to see if you can find ways that are right for you to ease some of the loneliness through connection in some of the ways that we've been talking about. And I would say that, say, for example, for you, when you don't have a partner, many of us, billions of people do not have partners. And so nurturing those friendships that you have is important. They are the family you choose. They can be the family you choose. And finding the people who want that kind of closeness is really a worthwhile endeavor, and it takes investment.
I'm going to jump to an observation question from Maggie, which is, well, she talks about us not necessarily being able to control how we feel, or the fact that you said that. And she's asking about, is it wrong to be emotionally sensitive? And I think particularly when it comes to relationships, some of us really feel sort of overwhelmed, or really like, a sense of, well, both very positive, but also quite overwhelming connection to what's going on around us.
Yeah. Well, it's not wrong to be emotionally sensitive, because, we feel what we feel. You can't choose what you feel. But what you can do is work with those feelings of hurt, those feelings of, oh, that person ghosted me, that person doesn't want to be with me. First of all, to look at it and to make sure that you are not making assumptions about the other person, that you're not filling in a blank, that we all fill in the blanks. When someone does something that we don't understand, or does something that we don't like, the mind immediately wants to fill in that blank and say, he did it for this reason, or she doesn't like me, whatever it might be. We tell ourselves a story pretty quickly. And one of the things we can learn to do better is to catch ourselves telling those stories, to step back and say, maybe that's not it at all. Maybe he's having a bad day. Maybe this has nothing to do with me. And it's so important, because otherwise some of the negative stories, first of all, they can hurt, and they can make us stay away from people who actually would be perfectly happy to be connected with us. So it's watching the stories as they arise, and then trying to make room for other possibilities when you're feeling sensitive.
Yeah, thank you. That's very wise. Joe's made a really interesting observation. She's just said, sorry, he or she has just said, I don't have many friends, but I don't feel lonely. Is that a problem? And I guess what that brings up for me is the idea that there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. And sometimes we really like our own company and feel happy just being by ourselves. And that's also a good thing, presumably. What's your sense, Bob?
That's exactly right. That loneliness is that subjective experience. I'm not as connected to other people as I want to be. And so you can be lonely in a marriage, you can be lonely in a crowd, right? And as you say, Mark, you can be quite content in solitude. And so it is really in the eye of the beholder. And so if you feel you are not as connected, it doesn't matter how many people are around you. Something needs work, something needs to be remedied, and we need to take it seriously.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Jude's made the point about the amazing well-being benefits of connecting with nature in all kinds of ways, and therefore asked a question that links back to something we started talking about earlier about virtual versus physical connections. So she made the point that actually, even looking at a picture of a tree, it might bring some benefit, even if it's not quite the same as being outdoors. But did any of your research really sort of unpick the online versus physical distinction at all, or are we still too early in this lifelong journey to have seen as much of that yet?
Well, it's not part of our research, but there is good research on the benefits of being in the natural world. And we know there are huge benefits. And one of the things that, of course, happens is that in the natural world, we're immediately in touch with what's bigger than ourselves, right? Like that just, I mean, just looking at a flower or looking at a tree, if you really look, it's like, whoa, there's so much there, right? And then if you're looking at a beautiful view, it helps us feel part of a bigger world, of a bigger universe. And we know that that actually takes us out of what David Foster Wallace used to call our skull-sized kingdoms. Like we get trapped in these little skull-sized kingdoms, right? And being in the natural world like reminds us, oh my gosh, there's such a big wide world that I'm part of. And there's something quite relieving about that, particularly when we are preoccupied and when we're lonely.
Well, there's loads of other great questions coming up, and I'm conscious that you need to get to your media interview fairly soon. I like this question from Hazel because I think it's got a lot of relevance. How should I deal with feeling like friends don't put as much into our relationships as I do? She goes on to say that she's single and wants a partner, but she said she's reaching out regularly to closest friends, but feels like it's always me doing the work. And I think I've felt that sometimes before as well.
Oh, and I have felt it too. It's painful. And I think first of all, we could ask, you could say, I would really love it if you would ask me to go out for coffee sometimes, that I want to connect with you, and it would be great if I'm not always the one to take the initiative. That might work. Someone might not have realized that they were doing that. Some people just won't do it. They're not into that. They don't do that. In which case, what I would say, don't throw those relationships away. Keep them for what they offer, but find other people with whom it can be more mutual. Sometimes I find this with people who don't listen well, who only talk about themselves. And I feel like, just there's no room for me in here. It's a little different from your question, but it is similar in that there isn't the kind of back and forth mutuality that we would hope for. I want someone else to be into me the way I'm into them, right? And so if you don't have that with someone, first see if you can tweak that a little by telling them what you would appreciate. And then if that doesn't work, look for other people with whom it can be more back and forth, more mutual.
You're reminding me of a moment I had of realization where I felt in a sort of, well, both myself and a friend felt frustrated by each other's behaviors. A friend I'd met who was Indian man, and we were both in Switzerland together, and his way of showing affection for someone was to talk about himself, and my way of showing interest was to ask questions. So we spent our entire relationship with him talking about himself and me asking questions, because that's how we both behaved. And he desperately wanted me to tell him about me, and I desperately wanted him to ask about me. And that was just like we both had these implicit behavioral assumptions. And in fact, when we realized that, it completely changed the relationship. It was like, oh, we can actually change this reciprocity. And it was really the fact that I felt brave enough to raise it, or in fact, actually credit to him. I think he raised it before I did. It really helped, actually.
That's a really important example, because I imagine it wasn't easy to have that conversation, right?
Correct.
But once you had it, it changed. It really strengthened your connection. It made things better. And so the possibility is that by having the difficult conversation, it can get better. And if it doesn't get better, well, then at least you tried.
Bob, you've been so generous with your time and wisdom. I love all of your tips, but I feel as though we never heard your answers to some of these questions at the beginning. So I would love to ask you, especially having written a book on the title, we asked the audience at the beginning, but what for you are some of the building blocks of a good life?
Well, for me, it's being engaged in activities that I find meaningful, like this, and it's being engaged with people who I care about and who care about me. That if it's the activities and that gets to purpose, and it's the people, those are kind of the big building blocks. And then when I'm lucky, maintaining my health.
Mm. And it's interesting you mentioned that word luck, because I know in another interview I heard with you, you talked about, health matters for our lifelong happiness, relationships really matter, but actually luck also plays a role, because we're not in control of the world around us, and sometimes we do have really bad luck, and we just have to respond to that the best way we can.
Yes, and we have to really be compassionate with each other, because some of us have very unfortunate things happen, and we need each other to look at that through the eyes of compassion.
Mm. Well, that's a lovely note to end on, Bob. You've brought a lot of compassion here. There's been so much kindness and support in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this, for the fantastic questions. And Bob, good luck with your interview. I know you're in demand and you're going to be live on television in a moment. Is there a final thought you'd like to leave us with before we part today?
Just that turning toward this kind of activity, turning toward these voices that make us feel more connected and more hopeful about the world. This is exactly what we need to do. Turning away from those voices that want to make us afraid and divide us, which there are many of, as we know. This is just the right place to turn your energy and your attention. So thank you all for doing this.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. See you again soon. Keep up the great work.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.